A 23-year-old woman found an old digital camera buried in the forest dirt. Her hiking group laughed, saying it was probably broken and worthless. But when she managed to charge it and saw what was stored on the memory card, she realized this camera contained something so horrifying it would haunt her forever. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments if you've ever found something mysterious in the woods. The morning air in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia carried the crisp promise of autumn, though the calendar still showed late summer. 23-year-old Isabella Reeves adjusted her hiking boots on the wooden steps of the ranger station in Shenandoah National Park, breathing in the familiar scent of pine needles and morning dew. This was her sanctuary, her escape from the suffocating routine of her office job in Richmond. Isabella worked as a data analyst for an insurance company, spending her weekdays staring at spreadsheets and computer screens in a sterile cubicle farm. The mountains were her antidote to the fluorescent-lit monotony that paid her bills. Every weekend, she drove the 2 hours from Richmond to these trails, trading her business casual for hiking gear and her anxiety for the peaceful rhythm of boots on dirt. Her colleagues thought she was eccentric. While they spent weekends at bars or shopping centers, Isabella disappeared into the wilderness with her camera and backpack. Her supervisor, Janet Morrison, often joked that Isabella was too antisocial for her own good and suggested she try normal activities like joining a book club or taking cooking classes. Even her parents, who lived in the suburbs of Norfolk, worried that their daughter was becoming too isolated, too dependent on solitude. But Isabella had discovered something in these mountains that she couldn't find anywhere else: clarity. The constant chatter of her mind, the worries about career advancement, student loans, and whether she was wasting her 20s, all of it quieted when she was surrounded by ancient oaks and weathered granite cliffs. Her camera had become her companion on these journeys, helping her capture moments of beauty that she could revisit during difficult weeks at the office. She had been hiking these trails for 3 years now, ever since she graduated from Virginia Tech with a degree she wasn't sure she wanted to use. The Appalachian Trail system had become as familiar to her as the streets of her neighborhood. She knew which overlooks offered the best sunrise views, which streams were safe to drink from, and which trails were usually empty enough for peaceful solitude. Today's destination was Ravens Hollow, a lesser-known trail that branched off from the main Appalachian Path about 5 miles north of the Thornton Gap entrance. The trail wasn't marked on most tourist maps, making it a favorite among serious hikers who preferred isolation to Instagram-worthy destinations. Isabella had discovered it during her second year of weekend adventures, when a wrong turn led her to a hidden valley that felt untouched by the modern world. Her backpack contained the usual essentials: 2 liters of water, energy bars, a first aid kit, her Nikon camera with extra batteries, and a lightweight emergency shelter. She had learned to pack systematically after a few early hikes, where poor planning left her hungry or unprepared for sudden weather changes. The discipline of preparation had become part of the ritual she cherished. The parking area at the trailhead was nearly empty this Tuesday morning. Isabella had taken a personal day from work, telling Janet she had a family obligation rather than admitting she needed a mental health day in the mountains. The lie felt justified. Her emotional well-being was important, even if her supervisor wouldn't understand. As she locked her Honda Civic and shouldered her pack, Isabella felt the familiar transformation beginning. The woman who spent 40 hours a week analyzing actuarial tables was already fading, replaced by someone more confident, more connected to her instincts. Her phone showed 2 bars of signal, but she switched it to airplane mode anyway. The whole point was to disconnect. The first mile of trail was familiar territory, a gradual climb through mixed hardwood forest that would lead to the junction where Ravens Hollow branched away from the main path. Isabella fell into the steady rhythm that had become second nature: measured steps, controlled breathing, eyes scanning the forest for the subtle signs that marked changing seasons. She passed 2 other hikers heading in the opposite direction, an older couple with matching REI gear who nodded politely but didn't stop to chat. Isabella preferred it that way. She had tried joining hiking groups in the past, but found that other people's conversations and energy disrupted the meditative quality she sought in these excursions. The junction to Ravens Hollow was marked only by a small cairn of stacked stones that someone had built years ago. Isabella turned left onto the narrower path, immediately noticing something unusual. The trail showed signs of recent disturbance that hadn't been there during her last visit 3 weeks ago. Broken branches hung at odd angles from trees beside the path. Fresh scuff marks in the dirt suggested heavy foot traffic or possibly vehicles, though she couldn't imagine how any motorized transport could have navigated this narrow trail. Most concerning were the areas where vegetation had been trampled or torn, as if something heavy had been dragged through the underbrush. Isabella paused, considering whether to continue. The rational part of her mind suggested turning back. Unusual trail conditions could indicate anything from illegal dumping to dangerous wildlife activity. But her curiosity was stronger than her caution. She had hiked these mountains long enough to trust her instincts, and nothing about the disturbance felt immediately threatening. She followed the damaged trail for another quarter-mile, noting how the destruction seemed to intensify as she moved deeper into the valley. What had started as scattered broken branches became a clear pattern of disturbance leading away from the main path toward a dense grove of mountain laurel and rhododendron. The grove was darker than the surrounding forest, its thick canopy filtering the morning sunlight into scattered green-gold patches on the forest floor. The air here felt different, cooler, damper, with an undertone of something that reminded Isabella of the metallic smell that lingered after summer thunderstorms. That's when she saw it. Partially concealed under a deliberate pile of leaves and fallen branches, about 30 feet from where the trail disturbance ended, was a rectangular object that clearly didn't belong in the natural environment. Isabella approached carefully, using a fallen branch to brush away the debris rather than touching it directly. The object was a digital camera, an older DSLR model with a sturdy black body that had protected it from the worst of the weather exposure. The camera was positioned carefully under the debris pile, not scattered randomly as if it had been lost or dropped accidentally. Someone had deliberately hidden it here. Isabella knelt beside the concealed camera, her trained analytical mind automatically cataloging details. The model appeared to be about 5 years old, a mid-range Canon that would have cost over $1,000 when new. The lens was a professional-grade zoom that suggested the owner was serious about photography. Most intriguingly, the camera showed no obvious signs of impact damage. No cracked lens, no dented body, no indication it had been thrown or dropped. The hiding spot itself was sophisticated. The debris pile looked natural from a distance, but up close, she could see it had been carefully constructed to completely conceal the camera while protecting it from rain and snow. Whoever had placed it here had taken time and care to ensure it would remain hidden and functional. Isabella felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Expensive equipment didn't end up buried in remote locations by accident. The methodical concealment suggested either criminal activity or someone hiding evidence of something they didn't want discovered. She should leave it alone, she knew. Report it to the park rangers and let them handle whatever legal complications might be involved. But as she lifted the camera from its hiding place, she noticed the memory card slot showed an SD card still inserted. The journalist part of her mind, the part that had originally made her consider a career in investigative reporting before practical concerns led her to data analysis, sparked with irresistible curiosity. The hike back to her car felt different with the camera weighing down her backpack. Isabella found herself glancing over her shoulder repeatedly, though she encountered no other hikers on the trail. The forest that had felt peaceful and welcoming during her morning hike now seemed to harbor invisible observers behind every tree. Back in Richmond, Isabella lived in a small apartment in the Fan District, a converted row house she shared with 2 roommates who worked night shifts and rarely crossed paths with her. Her room was her private sanctuary, decorated with framed photographs from her mountain adventures and filled with the outdoor gear that represented her real life outside the office. She set the camera on her desk and examined it more carefully under her reading lamp. The Canon model was one she recognized, a camera she had coveted herself before settling for her less expensive Nikon. The lens was a 70 to 200 mm telephoto, perfect for wildlife photography or distant subjects. There were no obvious external damages beyond some surface dirt and minor corrosion on the metal parts. Isabella retrieved a compatible battery from her camera equipment collection. Her serious interest in photography had led her to accumulate various chargers, batteries, and accessories over the past few years. She inserted fresh batteries and held her breath as she pressed the power button. The camera remained lifeless. She tried several times, holding the power button for different durations, but the LCD screen stayed dark and no internal mechanisms activated. The camera had probably suffered internal damage from moisture or temperature extremes during its time in the forest. But Isabella remembered that even when camera bodies failed completely, memory cards often remained readable. She carefully removed the 64 gigabytes SD card, a high-capacity model that looked relatively new, and inserted it into her laptop's card reader. Her computer immediately recognized the card. Isabella's pulse quickened as she saw the folder structure appear: 1,247 photos and 34 video files, with timestamps spanning several months and ending approximately 10 months ago. She opened the first image file. The initial photograph that appeared on her screen looked innocent, a well-composed landscape shot of familiar Blue Ridge terrain, taken during the golden hour when warm light filtered through the trees. The image quality was excellent, revealing that the photographer had possessed both skill and knowledge of their equipment. Isabella clicked through the first dozen images. More landscape shots, some wildlife photographs of deer and birds, several pictures of camping equipment, and what appeared to be a high-end hiking setup. The photographer seemed to be documenting an extended wilderness adventure, the kind of solo backpacking trip Isabella herself had always wanted to attempt. But as she continued scrolling through the chronologically arranged files, subtle details began to disturb her. The landscape shots started to repeat, not just similar compositions from the same general area, but identical locations photographed from incrementally different angles and distances, as if the photographer had returned repeatedly to specific spots for systematic documentation. The timestamps confirmed her suspicion. The photos weren't from a single hiking trip, but from multiple visits to the same locations over a period of several months. And those locations, Isabella realized with growing unease, were all within the Raven's Hollow area where she had found the camera. Then she noticed something in the corner of one forest photograph that made her stomach clench with dread. Barely visible among the trees, partially obscured by shadows and filtered sunlight, was a splash of unnatural color. Bright orange fabric that stood out sharply against the earth tones of the forest floor. Isabella zoomed in on the image, her hands beginning to tremble as the pixelated details became clearer. It wasn't fabric caught on a branch or a discarded piece of litter. It was clothing. On a person who was lying motionless among the trees. And this was only photograph number 43 of over 1,200. Isabella stared at her laptop screen, her mouth dry and her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The figure in the photograph was partially hidden by forest debris and shadows, but there was no mistaking what she was looking at. Someone was lying still on the forest floor, and whoever had owned this camera had been photographing them methodically. As she clicked to the next image, Isabella realized with mounting horror that this wasn't documentation of a hiking accident or someone who had gotten lost in the woods. The photos were too deliberate, too systematic, taken from multiple angles with professional precision. This wasn't a nature photography expedition gone wrong. Someone had been using these mountains, her sacred refuge from the world, for something unspeakable. And now she held the evidence in her hands. What she was about to discover in the remaining 200-plus files would shatter her understanding of the peaceful wilderness she thought she knew, and change her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Isabella's hands shook as she clicked through the next series of photographs. Her small apartment in Richmond's Fan District felt claustrophobic now, the familiar comfort of her personal space replaced by an oppressive sense of dread. The orange fabric in the previous image had been just the beginning. The next photos showed the same location from different angles, each revealing more details that Isabella wished she couldn't see. The figure on the forest floor was a young woman, probably in her 20s, wearing a bright orange hiking jacket that had made her visible among the browns and greens of the forest floor. Her blonde hair was matted with dirt and leaves, and her hiking boots were still laced tight, as if she had simply laid down to rest and never gotten up. But the systematic nature of the photography made it clear this was no hiking accident. The images were taken with professional precision, different focal lengths, various exposures, multiple compositions of the same scene. Someone had spent considerable time documenting this person's final moments, treating her death like a photographic study. Isabella forced herself to continue clicking through the files, her data analyst training helping her maintain some emotional distance by focusing on the technical details. The timestamps showed these particular photos were taken over a period of several hours, starting in the early morning and continuing past sunset. The photographer had returned to this location multiple times, using different lighting conditions to capture their subject. The metadata embedded in each file revealed more disturbing information. The camera's GPS function had been enabled, automatically recording the exact coordinates of each photograph. Isabella cross-referenced the locations with her hiking maps and felt her stomach drop. Every single photo had been taken within a 5-mile radius of the trails she knew intimately. Her weekend sanctuary had been someone's hunting ground. As she progressed through the chronological sequence, a pattern emerged that made her blood run cold. This wasn't documentation of a single incident. The locations changed, the seasons shifted from summer to fall to winter, and the subjects were different people. The second victim appeared in photos dated 3 months after the first. This time it was a man in his 30s, wearing expensive hiking gear and carrying a high-end backpack. He was positioned near a stream Isabella recognized as part of the White Oak Canyon Trail system. The same methodical photography approach, multiple angles, different lighting, professional composition treating human tragedy as artistic subject matter. Isabella realized she was looking at evidence of a serial killer who had been operating in these mountains for months, possibly years. Someone who used the isolated trail system to target solo hikers, people like herself who sought solitude in the wilderness. The photography wasn't just documentation. It was trophy collection, a way for the killer to relive and study their crimes. Her laptop screen displayed image after image of the photographer's victims, men and women of various ages, all wearing quality outdoor gear that suggested they were experienced hikers. All positioned in locations Isabella could reach within a day's hike from the main parking areas. All photographed with the same clinical precision that turned their deaths into a macabre art project. The most chilling aspect was the photographer's apparent invisibility. These were popular hiking areas, especially during peak seasons, yet someone had managed to commit multiple murders without detection. The careful concealment of the camera suggested this person understood investigation techniques and had planned extensively to avoid capture. Isabella paused the slideshow and tried to process what she was seeing. Her peaceful mountains, the trails where she had found clarity and escape from her mundane office life, had been transformed into a killing field. Every weekend hike she had taken, every moment of solitude she had cherished, had potentially put her in contact with a predator who viewed people like her as prey. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She had been hiking these trails alone for 3 years. She matched the victim profile perfectly. Young, solitary, equipped with expensive gear that marked her as an experienced hiker worth targeting. How many times had she crossed paths with this killer without knowing it? How many weekend mornings had she parked next to their vehicle at the trailhead? How many times had she felt the sensation of being watched and dismissed it as paranoia? Isabella forced herself to continue reviewing the files, knowing she needed to understand the full scope of what she had discovered before deciding how to proceed. The photos continued chronologically through different seasons, revealing that the killing had been going on for at least 2 years based on the timestamps. The photographer's technique evolved over time. Early images were more hurried, less carefully composed, suggesting someone still learning their craft. But as the sequence progressed, the photos became more sophisticated, displaying an artistic eye that made the content even more disturbing. This person wasn't just killing. They were developing their skills as both murderer and photographer. Some photos showed preparations. Images of hiking trails taken from concealed positions, showing popular rest spots and overlooks where solo hikers typically paused. The photographer had been conducting surveillance, learning the patterns of their hunting ground, identifying the best locations for ambush. Isabella found photos of hiking gear laid out meticulously, ropes, knives, chemical containers she couldn't identify. These weren't random crimes of opportunity, but carefully planned operations. The killer came prepared with specific tools and had developed a systematic approach to their work. Most horrifyingly, some photos showed the crime scenes at different stages. The photographer documented not just the final results, but the process itself. Isabella couldn't force herself to examine these images closely, but the timestamps revealed they sometimes spanned several hours, suggesting the victims had been kept alive during extended periods of torture. The video files proved even more disturbing than the photos. Isabella managed to play only a few seconds of the first video before closing it, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The audio contained sounds that would haunt her dreams: pleas for mercy, promises of money, or silence, the kind of desperate bargaining people attempted when faced with their own mortality. Cross-referencing the GPS coordinates with missing person reports she found online, Isabella began to understand the true scope of the crimes. At least 6 people who had been reported missing in the Blue Ridge area over the past 2 years appeared in these photographs. Their families were still searching for them, still hoping for their safe return, while their loved ones' final moments had been preserved in this digital gallery of horror. The killer had been operating with impunity, exploiting the very isolation that made the mountains appealing to hikers. The vast wilderness provided perfect disposal sites, while the scattered nature of the trail system made it unlikely that multiple disappearances would be connected by investigators. Each victim was probably assumed to have suffered an individual accident or gotten lost in the extensive backcountry. Isabella discovered that the photographer had been documenting more than just the crimes themselves. Later photos showed return visits to grave sites, sometimes months after the initial murders. The killer was revisiting their work, checking on the decomposition process, ensuring that remains were staying hidden. Some images showed bones being moved or reburied, evidence that this person understood forensic science and was actively working to prevent discovery. The methodical nature of the documentation suggested someone with significant technical knowledge. The camera settings were expertly chosen for different lighting conditions, the compositions showed artistic training, and the GPS data was being used strategically to map out hunting territories. This wasn't a disorganized killer acting on impulse, but someone approaching murder with the same systematic precision others might apply to legitimate photography projects. Reading through the image metadata, Isabella noticed that many photos contained additional embedded information, notes about weather conditions, victim behavior patterns, even ratings of different locations based on concealment factors. The killer was treating this like a professional project, constantly refining their techniques and documenting lessons learned. The final series of photos, taken just before the camera was hidden, showed the killer's most recent crime scene being carefully cleaned and disguised. Every trace of evidence was methodically removed or concealed. The natural environment was restored to hide any signs of disturbance, and the location was photographed from multiple angles to document the successful concealment. These weren't the actions of someone planning to stop. The careful documentation suggested a killer who intended to continue their work and wanted to preserve detailed records of their achievements. The hidden camera wasn't just concealing evidence, it was storing a how-to manual for future operations. Isabella sat in her apartment as evening shadows lengthened across her walls, staring at the camera that had brought this nightmare into her life. The weight of what she had discovered pressed down on her like a physical burden. 6 people were dead, their families were still searching for them, and she held the only evidence that could bring their killer to justice. But she also understood the danger she now faced. The killer had hidden this camera for a reason. They planned to retrieve it eventually, either to access the stored files or to continue documenting their crimes. If they discovered the camera was missing, they would know someone had found their trophy collection, and that someone would become their next target. Isabella's first instinct was to call the police immediately, but her analytical mind recognized the complications. The camera had been deliberately concealed on federal land. The crimes had occurred across multiple jurisdictions, and the evidence would need to be handled by specialists who understood digital forensics. A mistake in the chain of custody could compromise the entire case. She decided to contact the FBI directly, using the Bureau's tip line for violent crimes. Speaking to a duty agent in the Richmond field office, Isabella carefully explained her discovery without revealing her identity or exact location. The agent took her seriously once she began describing the photographic evidence and GPS coordinates, immediately transferring her to a specialist in serial crimes. Special Agent David Kowalski listened without interruption as Isabella described the scope of what she had found. When she finished, he asked her to remain exactly where she was and assured her that federal agents would be at her apartment within 2 hours. He emphasized that she should not attempt to examine any more files and should avoid any contact with the original discovery location. While waiting for the agents to arrive, Isabella made copies of the most crucial evidence, storing the files on encrypted drives she could hide separately from the original camera. Her insurance work had taught her the importance of redundant record-keeping, and she wasn't going to risk the only evidence of these crimes being lost or suppressed. When agents Kowalski and Martinez arrived at her apartment, they treated her with the seriousness she had hoped for but hadn't expected. They immediately secured the camera and memory card as evidence, but also spent considerable time documenting Isabella's account of how she had discovered the concealed device. They assured her that federal marshals would provide protection once the investigation became active, but warned her that she would likely be required to testify in eventual trials. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough. Within days, FBI technical specialists had processed the complete contents of the memory card, identifying all 6 victims and correlating the evidence with existing missing person cases. The GPS data allowed investigators to locate and excavate grave sites, finally giving families the closure they had been seeking. The breakthrough came when digital forensics experts analyzed the camera's service history and purchase records. The device had been registered to a wildlife photographer named Marcus Thornfield, who had been using his legitimate professional credentials to gain access to restricted areas of the national park system. Thornfield was arrested at his home in Charlottesville, where investigators found additional photography equipment, detailed maps of hiking trails, and journals documenting his selection criteria for victims. During questioning, Thornfield confessed to 8 murders across 3 states, using national parks and wilderness areas as his hunting grounds. He had specifically targeted solo hikers who matched Isabella's demographic profile: young, fit, experienced outdoors enthusiasts who hiked alone and could disappear without immediate detection. Isabella testified at Thornfield's trial, describing how her discovery of the hidden camera had led to solving multiple cold cases. The court sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the federal charges, with additional state sentences ensuring he would never be released. The mountains where Isabella had found peace were forever changed for her, but she took comfort in knowing that 6 families finally had answers, and that no other hikers would fall victim to Marcus Thornfield's methodical madness. Isabella's courage to investigate that hidden camera brought justice to 6 families and stopped a serial killer who had been hunting in America's wilderness areas. Sometimes the most horrifying discoveries lead to the most important truths. If this story impacted you, share it with someone who spends time alone in nature. Awareness can save lives.